So, after we have found no proof for the theory of evolution, neither in molecular genetics, nor in embryology, nor in anatomy, nor in paleontology, we will move on to another research field which is called population genetics. And here we can really observe that there are changes. And these changes, which we know from breeding research, are sometimes called a proof for evolution. However, we will now examine whether such changes like the formation of different kinds of tilapias in Lake Victoria in Kenya in a very short time is really a proof for Darwin's tree of life. Or the change of color in these moths, Darwin's famous Galapagos finches with different forms of beaks. We even can observe in nature such processes as formation of resistance against chemicals. We have insects which become resistant against insecticides. We know that certain plants, weeds, can become resistant against herbicides. Now, is this really evolution in action? In order to examine this, it is necessary to examine the process of such changes on the genetic level. And you will see it is very simple. The first step is always a variable population which has many different individuals, and all the individuals have a little bit different genes. For example, if you take the wolf, you will have many of them which are slightly different. You want to make a dog out of them. The first step is always isolation. You have to take out a subpopulation, or nature is doing this, and then you will see already now that the genes of your subpopulation are not necessarily containing all the genes which have been there in the original large population. If such a small subpopulation continues to be isolated, there is no other chance than to multiply by inbreeding. Inbreeding is very unhealthy. It leads to a loss of further genes. But if these small populations manage to survive and to stabilize, they will form new races. And you see that their genetic variability is quite different from each other. And this can, for example, produce different colors. But now comes the important point. All these genes have already been present in the original population. Therefore, these processes of race formation do not produce new genes. They only concentrate or extract existing genes. Compared to the original populations, these subpopulations have less genes. They have lost something. And a loss is just the opposite of evolution. But this mechanism is the reason for all these variations which we have seen before. And now let me talk a little bit about mutations. What do we know about mutations? Do they show evolution in action? Mutations are little changes in the genetic code. And all what we have observed are mutations like this. For example, loss of color. In the middle you have the natural form. Here you have lost the color blue. Here you lost the color of yellow. All color loss mutations, or you can change the size from this small size to the big size. But you know, you have less taste in the bigger one compared to the smaller one. Or scientists have made experiments with flies to show evolution in the laboratory. They exposed the flies to all kinds of chemicals and radiations to produce mutations. But all which they have found were either crippled flies, banded flies, or too many flies at the wrong position, like here. We know mutations of a fish that has no eyes, but just the rest of eyes. This fish lives in dark caves. There you don't need eyes, so it's not a disadvantage. But important here is to see that all we can observe are mutations which are either harmful or at best neutral. The same is true for our genome. We observe today in man that we accumulate harmful mutations. We do not evolve a better DNA in us. If we extrapolate this back to the past, it would mean that in the past everything must have been perfect and decayed, not vice versa, as evolutionary theory predicts. Now you may ask, but how does a resistant mutation look like? Is this not a mutation where we introduce a new organ, a new complicated construction? That we cannot conclude this necessarily. We know from several cases where we have studied resistance formation on the molecular level, on the genetic level. And I give you this example of Amaranthus hybridus, which is a weed, and chemists have designed a herbicide to fight against this weed. This herbicide, called atrazine, is designed that it attaches to a protein in this weed, which is called QB, and this protein is important for photosynthesis. When atrazine attaches to the protein, photosynthesis stops and the plant dies. But after some time you will realize that some of these Amaranthus hybridus plants will not react at all against this herbicide. And soon these individuals will form a new race, will dominate everywhere. And why is this? Because atrazine attaches only to a very special part of the protein QB, to only one amino acid, which is called serine. In the DNA construction book, you could say, this serine is coded by a letter of a triplet of 3 letters. If the reading machine in the cell reads AGT, 3 different nucleotides, then serine will be built at this particular position. And if there is a single point mutation, which means if one of the letters accidentally is changed into another one, which can always happen by some radiation, for example into GGT, then the reading machine, which reads GGT, will no longer build serine, but it will build glycine at this position. The protein, which has glycine instead of serine, can still perform photosynthesis. However, the herbicide atrazine cannot attach to glycine, and therefore this variant is resistant against this poison. But it is important to understand that in this process the information content of the DNA has not been increased. No new function or construction has been introduced, only an existing function has been defended. You can compare it to a house with a door. When you destroy the lock, a thief can no longer come in. But you would not say, now I have improved my house, when you have destroyed the lock. So this is an example of really a positive mutation, but positive because it leads to an advantage for survival, but it is not an example for evolution, because evolution needs to introduce new organs and new constructions. Therefore, we have to agree with what Maciej Giertych wrote in the proceedings of this conference in Rome in 2009. He said, "This in no way helps to support the theory of evolution. Textbooks that speak of race formation as an example of a small step in evolution, positive mutations giving new functions or organs, adaptation to antibiotics or herbicides as examples of evolution are misinforming." So here we can finish now our research for proofs of evolution. All the different areas of science have to agree there is no proof for evolution. This would be sufficient to stop and to say, remove it from the textbooks. But we can continue, and we will see that there is much evidence from science which proves that evolution cannot happen. And I start with physics and the most fundamental law of nature, the so-called law of entropy or the second law of thermodynamics. It works like this. This represents an amount of gas molecules which are flying around everywhere in the space, and they permanently exchange their momentum and their direction by random collisions. And this always results in a disordered distribution of any particle, of any matter in space. So every piece of matter, when it starts from an ordered configuration, an ordered distribution, at any time later it will be found in a disordered distribution. This is true for every chemical and physical reaction. But we can call it also a state of low probability, and the disordered distribution is a state of high probability. But the opposite, that there could be any natural process that turns a disordered distribution into an ordered distribution of matter, this does not exist. For the experts among us, the physicists have described this in a precise formula. They can calculate the probability of any arrangement of matter and tell you exactly how likely it is that it can exist in this way. And they call the probability of matter the entropy. And then the textbook formulation of the second law of thermodynamics goes like this. A system, just matter somewhere, a system, will never change by itself into a significantly less probable state. It will not be more ordered. That means its entropy, its probability, will never decrease by more than a few k. K is the very small Boltzmann constant, which is negligible. This may sound very sophisticated, but it's just our ordinary all-day experience, and you will agree with it soon. Let me give you an example. If I put a staple of papers here, and I order them very nicely, put them here on the table, and I open the window and the door, and the wind will come through, and I come again next year, what do I expect? A complete mess. And then I say to myself, I will come again in 10 years. Would anybody of you expect that the wind, if it acts long enough, will again collect all these papers and put them nicely ordered? This is impossible, because the second law of thermodynamics says no natural process can go from disorder to order. Here is an example of a scientific journal which says that no exception to the second law of thermodynamics has ever been found, not even a tiny one. But here comes the problem for the theory of evolution. While the second law of thermodynamics says disorder can never turn into order, the theory of evolution says the opposite. Disorder turns into order. It says that in the beginning we had hydrogen molecules which were very disordered, and these hydrogen molecules over billions of years formed a human being who started to give lectures against evolution. And Albert Einstein said that the second law of thermodynamics is the only physical theory of universal content which I am convinced will never be overthrown. Therefore, any hypothesis which collides with this law has to be given up. Now, when you argue like this, and you have in your auditory some learned people, they will immediately tell you that the second law of thermodynamics is only formulated for closed systems. But for open systems, like the Earth, like our body, things are totally different. And what is an open system? It's very simple. It's just an arrangement of matter which can be heated or cooled, where energy can be introduced or exported. That's all about it. And it's true, in these cases, order can appear. But we will soon see that this kind of order is totally different from biological order. I give you one example. We know that plants can, when we introduce energy, sunlight, transform disordered molecules, a set of disordered molecules of carbon dioxide and water by photosynthesis into more complex, more ordered molecules like sugar. So it seems that here we have an exception to the second law of thermodynamics. The entropy decreased from here to here, order increased. But this argument overlooks one important factor, that in order to make such a process happen, you need to have the chloroplast machine in the plant. And this chloroplast contains the plan and the mechanism to change disordered CO2 and water into sugar molecules, which are more ordered. So, in other words, this structure here, this carbohydrate structure, is already pre-programmed in the chloroplast reactor. So, the order which we can see here is not produced from nothing, it's just made visible. It was already present in the chemical reactor. It's only transferred to the surface, you could say. Another such example which we all know, if we take water molecules in the form of steam and we cool it down, we open the system, export energy, we cool it down, we will certainly see that very beautiful ordered structures can appear. But it is important to understand how this works. And it's like this: when you cool down the water molecules, their geometry, H2O, leads them to arrange in a hexagonal structure. They have no other chance. They have a certain angle between them, and when they are cooled down, they get closer to each other, and so they form hexagons, hexagonal tubes even. If the cooling proceeds, then these tubes have no other chance than forming a crystal with a six-fold symmetry. So you see, this ordered structure of the snowflake was already pre-programmed in the geometry of the water molecule. And this does not produce new order, it only makes order visible. But you can understand that a DNA molecule cannot be produced by cooling down its components, the nucleotides, because the DNA molecule is a code. You will not get the information into it when you cool down some molecules. It's totally different to such open systems processes. And you cannot cool down bacteria to obtain a human. So, we can agree with what one of the leading researchers in such entropy-reducing phenomena has said in Physics Today. He said that in open systems there exists a possibility for formation of ordered low entropy structures at sufficiently low temperatures. This ordering principle is responsible for the appearance of ordered structures such as crystals. Unfortunately, this principle cannot explain the formation of biological structures. Biological structures do not belong to this kind of exceptions, therefore they are excluded by the second law of thermodynamics. They cannot come from natural processes. So what then was Darwin's error? He mixed variation with evolution. We observe horizontal variation by race formation, as we have just seen, by reduction of genes or by mutations. But these processes do never increase the content of the genome. On the other hand, evolution claims that very small or simple creatures, which actually are not simple at all, can turn into completely different creatures with different functions and organs over many, many, many steps, which all decrease the entropy. But this is therefore excluded by the natural law. It cannot happen by no natural process, also not by mutation and selection, not over billions or trillions of years. Let me come to another proof against evolution why it is impossible. It comes from the problem to introduce information. According to evolution, reptiles turned into birds. This requires a huge change in the DNA molecule. At least thousands, if not millions of changes. Therefore, it must have happened by thousands or millions of different stages, step by step. But now comes the problem. It started with mutations of the reptile, and selection would only find the fittest reptile limbs. So during the first 1,000 or so changes, selection would not lead into the direction of a wing. It could not find the wing. It would only optimize the existing construction of a reptile. But then there is no way how the information for a change towards the wing is provided. Therefore, it is completely statistically impossible that this mutation selection process of a reptile will lead to a wing. The same is true for this famous icon. Usually it suggests that from ape to man we needed only 3 mutations and then we are there. But in reality there must be a change in the DNA at least at thousands or millions of letters to change all our construction. It's very, very difficult to change it. There's much more information in us. Therefore, a more realistic icon would look like this, and this is still too few. It would be much longer. Or in this diagram, it would mean that a chimp wired thousands of steps turned into a man, and this would lead to the same problem, that for the first hundreds or thousands of changes, natural selection would only optimize the existing 4-limb walker and not know in which direction to go for an upright walker. So the information cannot be provided. The information for change towards Homo is not provided by selection. Another proof against evolution, it's very simple from anatomy. If evolution were true, then we would not see, as we do see, that every organ in nature is complete. No organ in nature is half finished or evolving. We do not see any half finished eye, ear, nose, leg, wings. We see certain degenerations, but we see nothing in the process of evolution. If evolution were true, then we had in the past there were thousands of reptiles which had half-evolved wings, ever better and better. Why were they here? Because they had more fitness than the reptile. But why do we not see today, here is today, why do we not see any of these intermediates, although they were fitter, per definition, than the beginning, than the initial one, the reptile, the most primitive? The only logical answer is that they have never existed. There was no evolution. We can continue with all living creatures like this so-called very simple one, the single cell, which is indeed a highly complicated, you could say, a fabric. If this had come from evolution, from some primitive molecules, so-called chemical selection did it, why then today do we see all kind of simple molecules, all kind of single cells completely ready, but no single one in between? They should exist. They were more fit for survival than the primitive one, which still exists, so they had a higher probability to survive until today. Or these different eyes. The insect eye is so good that insects can look at the starlight and see the color of the stars. If you take a telescope, you can see that the stars are not white. You can see red or blue color in many of them. And insects have eyes which are so good that they can distinguish the color of the eyes of the stars. Our eye here in the middle is better than any camera. It can automatically change the sensitivity to brightness by circa 10 orders of magnitude, which no camera can. And there's a mirror telescope eye in marine creatures. All these are only completely formed. If they had come from a prototype eye, by many steps increasing the fitness. Where are they? And this is a wonderful plant which grows in Europe. It's an aron. And this plant cannot have evolved like all the other creatures. I will explain to you what this plant is doing. When it gets dark, this plant can still be seen because of this surface where the moonlight is reflecting. It wants to attract insects. But in order to be more successful, the plant switches on a machine inside which produces the smell of rotting meat, decaying meat. The insects smell this, they are landing on this surface, but the surface is full of oil, so they fall down. And this is a section, and you see they are falling down, and they pass this mechanism which opens in one direction but closes in the other direction. They can't escape. This plant does not want to eat the insects. It wants the insects to distribute their pollen, which they have collected from other plants. And in order to make them run faster, it's already late in the evening, it has a special machine. It has a heating inside. It can switch on heating to raise the temperature. They run faster, and after they've done their job, this pollen of this plant are opened and they fall on the back of the insects. Then this surface is no longer oily but rough, so that they can climb up. The closing gate is opening, so they can escape and continue at the next plant. Now you can imagine how many changes, how many thousands or millions of intermediates must have existed in very large numbers if such a plant had come to existence by mutation and selection. So thousands, millions of mutations which were fitter for survival than the simple leaf. The simple leaf exists today in many, many variations. But of these intermediates, we should still see many, but we don't see any. Therefore, they cannot have existed. Of course, all the beautiful organs in nature are only there fully formed, not evolving. Our language is completely formed, which proves that there is no such thing as an evolving spirit. In fact, we observe the opposite of evolution of language. We observe that ancient languages were more complicated than what we speak today. Now, a final proof that the theory of evolution has not produced us, it comes from philosophical analysis of mutation and selection. Suppose you have simple creatures which have no consciousness, which cannot feel pain, but they can react when there is danger. They would escape. And now imagine that you have the same kind of creature, the same source of danger, for example heat, but these creatures have consciousness, they can feel pain. But you see, the reaction is exactly the same. Therefore, for selection, this consciousness doesn't bring any advantage for survival. Therefore, whatever someone believes consciousness is, either as it's a spiritual, it's a soul, or it's a purely material thing, as materialists believe, in any case, he would have to admit that to produce consciousness, it would require millions of mutations. But mutations which do not change the behavior, nor the size or the shape or anything of the material part, of the visible part of the body, they will never be selected by evolution. Now consider us. We also have consciousness. For example, we can feel pain. A robot can perform the exactly same reaction when there is something which would produce pain on the robot finger. He has no consciousness. It does not feel anything, but the behavior could be even better in terms of survival fitness, of reaction, than our behavior. Therefore, a robot would have the same survival fitness for less complexity. That means any selection process over millions of years of evolution would select out us feeling humans. But here we are. Therefore, the conclusion, this is now the end of my talk, the human soul cannot have been produced by mutation and selection. The human soul is spiritual, it's not material anyway. And the second conclusion, eyes, hands, legs are needed, must be controlled by a conscious mind. Without that, we would run into all directions and it would be useless to have a hand or legs or eyes without consciousness. Therefore, all these organs and the entire body can also not have been produced by mutation and selection. Now, this is the end of the talk. I would quickly resume what we have all gone through. It was a huge amount of data. We have first the concept of evolution. We went through different areas of research to search for proofs for evolution, and this was all negative. While on the other hand, we found in thermodynamics, in information theory, in anatomy and in philosophy 4 proofs against evolutionary theory. And the conclusion is, from pure reasoning and observation, that all the species we observe are original. They have been the same since their origin, with the exception of a natural variability, which is always a process downward, against evolution. It is always a loss of construction, of function, of DNA. In the beginning, the creatures were perfect and very good. Thank you for your attention.